Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to do a follow-up Ukraine video to the one I did a couple of nights ago regarding the offensive, the counter-offensive that's taking place in Kherson and also what's going on elsewhere in Ukraine. It's going to be not going to be covering all of Ukraine because there's so much every day that's going on, but just want to make a couple of points before I talk a little bit about Putin and what Putin's options are, because I wrote something some time ago that I thought indicated that, or at least showed that Putin really can't win. There's no way he can win, and even though I wrote that at the beginning, well, not quite the very beginning of the campaign, but after Russia had sort of pulled out of the Kiev area and taken some big hits in their invasion, I wrote it, and all the points still stand, and possibly even more so now. But anyway, let's go back to Kherson and what's going on with the counteroffensive. So I talked to you the other night about how Ukraine announced this counteroffensive for weeks in the Kherson Oblast, and this brought in reinforcements from the Russians, who rushed a load of troops and equipment into this region because they knew there was an offensive coming, a counter-offensive coming. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians went about destroying bridges in this area and also causing mayhem with their HIMARS, their long-range rocket systems that were taking out sort of depots and equipment. And now it's looking pretty bad for the Russians. However, I mean this is Institute of the Study of War, and this is their map of the area. So remember, all up here is a river basically. So you can't cross here unless you've got bridges, and the Ukrainians took out the bridges, which has meant that the Russian forces have been trapped in this area of land here with no way of getting out and also no way of getting supplies in. Now, the thing about this region is that this is stocked with some of the best Russian troops. Okay, so that means that this is slow going for the Ukrainians, and in fact, they are taking huge losses. So I talked about, really you want 5-to-1 ratio of attacking to defending troops, 7-to-1. If the more the merrier. Because if you're going through settlements, particularly, then oops, what's happened there? If you're going through settlements, then that's going to be very costly. Kherson is an interesting area, or maybe not very interesting area, because it's very flat. It's completely flat, very agricultural area, and so actually you don't really need to use roads there. So you can march through whole sort of and drive through whole huge sort of fields of flat land to get to places. So that works in the favour of the Ukrainians. However, it is slow going because the Russians have dug themselves in literally into trenches as well as into settlements, and these are the good troops. So this is expensive for the Ukrainians, and it is slow going. They are making inroads in this middle section, and inroads in the northern section up there, as well as sort of continuing to fight there. And there was, I think, a little pushback from the Russians down in the southern section, which is the closest to Kherson. Now, the genius was, blocking them in and then picking them off. This is a war of attrition. There is attrition going on here with the Russian forces, and as long as the Ukrainians have enough resources themselves, troops and equipment, then this is like a Greek tragedy. The Russians are going to lose here. And if they lose here, then they lose Kherson. Now, what will be interesting is how the Ukrainians try and retake Kherson, because they don't want to destroy it. It's not like what the Russians do, which is just bomb the heck out of a lot of these places and turn them into a moon landscape, and then march in with relatively few troops because everything's destroyed. Ukrainians don't want to do that to their own settlements, so they don't want to bomb the heck out of Kherson. So how do they take it, dealing out minimum damage but being optimally effective? That's going to be interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of what's going up on in the Kharkiv area. In fact, let's go there now. So To return to our main map, this is the announced counteroffensive, and at the same time there are several counteroffensives going on up and down this front. In fact, there's some pretty fierce fighting happening, and it looks like this has been partly a big feint, which is to draw troops away, say that this is the Kherson area is where it's all going to be happening, and then do some surprise counterattacks in other areas. And that's precisely what's happened. So one such area is by Kharkiv. So I'm going back to up here, up at the top, where originally originally the Russians had attacked and were knocking on the Kharkiv door, and then they were pushed back at the same time as the Russians retreated from Kiev. And all along the top, you remember, all along the north here, they had the territory, or at least certainly the roads. Sumy was still Ukrainian, but that was under a whole heap of pressure, and Kharkiv as well. They pushed the Russians back, but they are still within artillery and rocket range, and so Kharkiv is every night gets attacked with long range equipment. Anyway, so that's the Kharkiv area. That's the second city of Ukraine. So there's now been this surprise counterattack. So Kharkiv is here now. This is my map drawing ability, so I do apologise. So the blue line are rivers. The blue lines are rivers. So there's a river that goes along here, and there's another river that joins it up here with an artificial lake going down there. Now, the Russians, there's this front line. Actually, the Russians are this side of the river, and the Ukrainians are this side of the river. Follows the river here, and then actually cuts down here. So the Ukrainians hold this area, and then there's a little salient here, a little bridgehead. And this is Balaklia, and this has been in the news heaps the last couple of days because this is where some this really quick fighting has taken place. I'll talk about that in a second. So this front line goes down to Izium. Now, Izium was taken by the Russians, and this was super important because it's like a logistical hub that supplies everything down here. And this was so important for the Russians because to get Izium is to be able to take all this territory here. So really what the Russians certainly wanted to do was to have the whole of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, which is at least to have a line pretty much down there. But their objectives kept shrinking. Originally it was whole of Ukraine, then it was like this area, then it shrunk to this area, then it shrunk to this area, and then it's like, okay, we'll just keep this area type thing and make, just chew at the territory at the edges and make slow advances. It's become more and more modest as they have faced greater and greater resistance. So, but the key is Izium. And in fact, there's a theory to say that if Russia lose Izium now, then they've lost. I mean, they really are on the back foot because they can't really supply they won't be able to succeed in any of their larger objectives because you would then have to go to somewhere like this settlement over here, Staroblisk. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but this settlement over here is the next place really that acts as a logistical hub, and that means much further up to Russia, loads more trucks, loads more fuel, loads more time to feed any offensive down here. So they would pretty much lose all of this land here. Now, the key to Izium, if we take it one step back, is probably Kupiansk, which is this hub up here. So what the Ukrainians have done is they've made a lightning strike through to Shevchenkovy here. Probably pronounced that terribly badly. I apologise. And what the Ukrainians have done is, so talking about urban warfare, they have not gone in necessarily, but they've gone round, and in fact they are now east of there, because obviously it's going to be really expensive in terms of troops and deaths and ammunition and resources to take over urban settlements. So if they can just cut them off and force the Russians to pull out by encircling them, then that's what they're going to do. And in fact, that's what's happened here in Balaklia, which is this one that's been on the news. Now, what's happened in this place, and it's interesting that it's the other side of the river, so it's this tiny little bridgehead here, is that the Ukrainians haven't necessarily attacked it full on, but they've encircled it and they forced a disorganized withdrawal, disorganized retreat. Now, in terms of tactics, what you if you're moving backwards, if you're withdrawing, which is what the Ukrainians did in large parts of the east when they were under the kosh from the Russians, is that they did an organized sort of withdrawal, which is to say we're going to withdraw on our terms and get all of our equipment out and fight as we do that, but we won't leave anyone behind and we won't leave anything behind. And that's but we're going to cause you, the Russians, a huge amount of pain as we withdraw. So every inch of land costs you in terms of lives and resources. And so that is a good way of attriting the causing attrition to the Russian forces. What the Russians haven't done here is exactly that. Is they've done a disorganized withdrawal. They couldn't, because of the river there, they couldn't get their equipment out, and so they've left an absolute shed load of equipment here and escaped in the only way they could, just out the side here. And therefore, Ukrainians so quickly have they advanced here that that's what is going on. Now, I mentioned before that you had this, they're choosing to attack around here because there are very poor quality forces. The LNR, the DNR, Luhansk and Donetsk, sort of, their national kind of militia army. So those are full of conscripts who are forced conscripts, many of them, and low quality training and low morale. Not only that, but it turns out that a lot of the troops around here are military police. They're not even proper sort of army personnel. And these guys don't know how to use multiple rocket launchers. They don't have any anti-tank weaponry. So they are incredibly weak. And this is why the Ukrainians have been able to capture most of this territory this quickly. And really importantly, compared to Kherson, they have done it with really low troop losses on their own side. I mean, they really haven't lost hardly anything. It's been an absolute win-win for the Ukrainians here. Whereas if you go back to Kherson, every kilometer here is costing the Ukrainians dearly in lives, and both sides are just getting hammered. Even though the Ukrainians are taking territory, and they will take the whole area eventually for sure, short of some kind of huge mobilization or something. Over in this neck of the woods, Ukrainians are just marching through like a knife through butter, and that's really clever because they attack at the weakest point, and their key to begin with is going to be Kupiansk. So if they can hit this area here, surround it, cut it off, and these roads, then they're going to effectively cut off Izium. And what they'll want to do with Izium, so this is where it's going to look a little bit like Kherson possibly, if they can blow up the bridges along this river here, the Uskil, which isn't a huge river, but there are some artificial lakes that are quite difficult to cross. And if they hit some other sort of bridges along here, then actually the Russians are going to struggle to get to exfiltrate from this area their troops. Or retreat or make an orderly, organized withdrawal. So again, it could look very much like that. This is pretty exciting stuff for the Ukrainians because they are moving quickly. And if they get Izium, so Izium has this bridgehead the other side of the river that again, if they cut it off here, then there's really very little option to get all the troops and artillery out. So the troops will be able to, scoot out here maybe, but they're going to be leaving a lot of artillery and equipment and armament here in the same way that they did at Balaklava. So this is going to be a really big one to look for. What's going to happen around Izium and Kupiansk, and it, I can see it very much looking like Russia are going to lose all this area to the west of the Uskil River. and this will have huge ramifications strategically for them, for over much greater area than just this particular little map here. If you remember Severodonetsk here and what happened a couple of months ago, where the Ukrainians were making an orderly withdrawal, but they try to hold on to this for as long as possible. And people were arguing that this was actually Zelensky making this a political thing because it looked good. Didn't want to leave this very important town or city. And actually that cost the Ukrainians quite a bit, and people were saying they should have pulled out much quicker, and there was too much political involvement. But this was all to do with the Ukrainians withdrawing in an orderly fashion, and arguably that's not what's happening over here. So that's where we're at. This is somewhere to look at very closely, because this will have ramifications for the much larger area, and this is what war in Ukraine, the great YouTube channel has shown himself. As they got a little bit of resistance around certain places, they just moved on to take others and just go for the path of least resistance, kind of surrounding this Balaklia area, and then really it's all about marching on to Kupiansk and then looking at Izium as the ultimate goal for that particular small region, and Lyman. All these areas super important, and they've been trying to protect Slavyansk. Izium had some factories that produced, like the Stugna. These they had armaments factories. I think it was in Izium. So that's a pretty important. Obviously, they're not going to be functional anymore, but that was a really big loss when it happened. And what the Ukrainians were able to do in the months after that is actually contain them in this salient here really, really well. So the Russians should really have marched onwards and downwards, in a southerly direction once they took Izium. And do you know what? For months they've been unable to, because they've been hemmed in by really effective artillery and air support from the Ukrainians. That has been a really great success that hasn't been, I don't think, lauded enough, because they've been hemmed in there and unable to properly support the region to the south and east. So there you go. That's my opinion on what's going on tactically up there. Definitely something to look out for. And now I want to talk a little bit about Putin. So really, what could stop the Ukrainians here and in Kherson? Well, the only thing really that could stop them, other than tactical nukes, which is a very real threat, and I'll talk about that in a second, the only other thing is just a whole bunch of fresh troops, reinforcements. But it takes a long time to get those people to those places, especially when you don't really have those troops. So it turns out that Russia has fewer sort of decent troops than they're supposed to be the second greatest army in the world, with all this technology and all these pieces of equipment. It turns out that most of those pieces of equipment were mothballs and left in fields to rust, and they're having to bring back outdated equipment. A lot of their high-tech stuff they sold to other countries, and they just don't have what people thought they had. And this is actually the same with personnel. But as I mentioned in the previous video, unfortunately for Putin and Shoigu and the Kremlin, they can't mobilize, because if they mobilize, do a general mobilization and get conscription across the nation of Moscow, two things will happen. One, it's an admission that they basically lose in a war, and it's actually a war and not a special operation or whatever they call it. And two, it'll be deeply unpopular. And the war, we know, is becoming more publicly unpopular. So this is not a good move for Putin. So he's a bit stuck there. He really wants to mobilize. What he's done is he's raised the age limit for people to be able to fight in the army and to have their conscription. They have a national conscription every year. He's extended everything to bend all the rules so that as many people can stay in the army as possible. And he's also asked for different regions to provide troops, etc., etc., etc. Except there's just not enough, and they're not getting the quality troops. Of course, having to train all these troops, these are fresh newbies being thrown in. These aren't quality, veteran troops. They are also using an awful lot of mercenaries, so particularly down in the Donetsk area here. I know Bakhmut and down here as well. The Wagner mercenaries um, are really actually doing some of the best work for the Russian forces. So they're trying all the ways they can to maintain force numbers, but also looking to increase those numbers. They've changed another law recently. They want a huge amount of troops without having to formally mobilise. The thing is, that's a long-term option. What Russia need are troops here very quickly, and in Kherson very quickly. They need them now. We know they're suffering in terms of armament. They're buying equipment off North Korea and Iran, for goodness sake. And as soon as you're buying equipment off North Korea and Iran, who are your mates? What does that say about you as a nation? If your closest allies are North Korea and Iran, and in fact Putin's just been shaking hands with the military coup dictatorship in Myanmar. So what used to be Burma. So you've got Putin having very few options to get stuff, and China not seeming to want to help because they've got so much to lose. If they annoy the West too much, that's an economic catastrophe waiting to happen. Whereas Russia, even though they're ideologically closer to Russia, economically speaking, and China is an economic powerhouse. It may be communist, but it's a Chinese version of communism, which is to say it's driven by the economics of the nation. Russia represents very little economically for China, and the rest of the world represents quite a lot more. So they've been hedging their bets, staying out of it to a large degree, giving a couple of public statements in broad support of Russia, but not really, and actually saying more in their inaction than anything else. And so, really, what Russia would want, in my opinions, would be China to come to their help in a much more overt way, and then but then we got World War III. Or they just need a shed load of troops and equipment, and they're just not going to be able to get that. So I can't see them being able to, reverse what's going on in both this Kharkiv counteroffensive and in Kherson in the counteroffensive there. The question is, what are Putin's other options? How the problem is, and this is what I wrote in my article. Let me just find that article. So I wrote this piece all the way back in April. Where to now, Putin? Because there's no way you can win. And back in April, it was exactly the same situation as it is now in terms of what Putin's options, are. And look at this. So this is April, right? And we're now May, June, July, August. So we're 4 months later. And Russia have been pushed back from they'd just been pushed back from all of this massive area here, but they've been pushed back. All of these pink areas at the very north near Sumy, pushed back in Kharkiv, and pushed back in quite a few of these areas. And realistically, they've made no significant gains. So that tells you as much as you need to know about how this is going for Russia. And as I said here, he can't win because what he needs to do is come out of this whole thing in as good a sense as possible. He needs to come out feeling like he's won. Now, if he can't really win, and why can't he win? Why do I keep saying this? Well, he can't really win because he's already lost too much. So it's going to take decades for Russia to economically bounce back from sanctions and from the expenditure they've put into the war and for what they're losing in income. Yes, they are still making quite a lot of money in gas and oil, but actually the oil price is going back down, and that is not long-term sustainable, and they've lost out in so much else, not just in terms of sanctions, but in terms of soft power and influence around the world. So they have completely damaged the image of Russia, but also damaged the kind of the economic standing of Russia. Um, you know, I know post Brexit, the UK is the bottom of the G20 in terms of predictions for our economic growth. Well, we're not quite bottom. Russia is bottom. We are 19th. So, but I don't want to get onto Brexit. But Russia are in trouble. So in order to balance the books, there needs to be significant gain in what this offensive is doing for him. But he's not taken Ukraine, and he won't be able to take Ukraine. And even if he did take the areas he's got, there's massive amounts of rebuilding that would need to take place. The amount of money he would need to spend to rebuild that is phenomenal. They're not going to get Odessa and Mykolaiv down here, and it looks like they're going to lose Kherson, and this could cause problems for even having Crimea. There could be this situation where he actually loses Crimea. Now, even if he doesn't lose Crimea, he's basically economically lost, and all he's done is bombed a load of places into rubble, and then he's going to have to pay to bring them back up to then reignite them economically. And I know there's quite a few natural resources in these areas that he's taken. It's still, he can't win. He can't gain enough from any of this stuff to balance the losses he will be making for decades. And not only that, these places will be occupied. You've already got a huge amount of. So if we go back to this map, for example, that part of the map is there to show that there is partisan activity, and there's partisan activity there as well in Kherson, which is to say that people are blowing up Russian collaborators left, right, and centre at the moment. And as an occupying force, not only is that horrible to live in these places where you've got that going on, but it's very costly, and people are going to die. And so even if Russia kept all of this region, it will be a region of partisan partisan activity under a forced occupation, and that's only going to be painful. And you're going to need to give a lot of effort to trying to maintain that scenario. A lot of troops will have to be stationed, and this is going to be very costly in terms of money and lives. So I really don't know what Russia can do to come out this whole conflict feeling like it's been worth it. I literally think it's actually impossible. And so what do you do if you're Putin? Well, what do you do if you're Russia? Well, you have some kind of coup or some kind of revolution. I don't know if that's going to happen. The longer this goes on, the greater the chance that might be. You've got the health problems that Putin has. And so he might not be lasting too much longer. Maybe that's what we've got to hope for, is that this goes on for a year or two, and then eventually Putin dies and it all changes, and then a new Russian leader comes in and say, oh, terribly sorry about that, let's give Ukraine back. Or you have a coup, or you have a revolution. But outside of that, what can Putin do? Well, it's tactical nukes, or it's get China involved, or it's somehow mobilize and send in an absolute ton of troops. That is not going to end well. Like, if he mobilizes, there's going to be so much discontent in Russia, and there will be so many more body bags coming back, and Ukraine will be fighting, for their very existence. You've got to remember that what the Russians fighting for. They're fighting for Putin and what he wants. But they're not fighting for their homeland. They are invaders, and some of these are conscripts. They don't want to be there. So there's a real difference here, and that some people say it's a force multiplier, which is to say that that kind of morale is worth so much more on the battlefield. And so even if he does mobilize and get a huge force together and can somehow train them up to an acceptable level, what can he do with them when you've got an entire nation that you would need to properly invade and force occupy the whole nation? I mean, that's never going to happen, and it will be incredibly costly. And if he goes for the tactical nukes, then NATO will just, I'm sure, will step in. And the thing is that the Russian forces can be wiped out really quickly by NATO because they've been shown they can't even take on Ukraine. Well, you take on the whole of NATO with the technology that NATO has, and the Russian forces will be obliterated pretty quickly. It's only the nuclear threat that stops that from happening. If nuclear weapons didn't exist, NATO would have come in. Well, NATO wouldn't exist, but the West would have come in and just taken out Russia and said, "Don't do that. You can't invade someone else," and just destroy their army as quickly as that. I'm positive that would have happened. But the nuclear thing is what keeps everyone scared and at bay, and that's the threat that Putin has. But that's all he's got. There are I can't see any options here, and so therefore Putin's lost. So is now what he's considering: how do I least lose? But he's still got to sell that to everyone else as a win in his country. Otherwise, he's going to become deeply unpopular because this will all be for nothing. And this will all be for nothing as far as Russia's concerned. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. And I'm sure, like the last video, I'll attract a couple of, pro-Putin bots and apologists. But they often just come along and say, that's a load of rubbish, and don't provide any substantiation for why that's rubbish. It's like, okay, brilliant. So you're just a bot. I'm happy to be wrong. I'm just some guy on the internet, like, interested in these things. But what do you think? If you were Putin, what would you do? Obviously, you wouldn't be the nice human being I'm sure you are. You would be Putin. But if you were Putin and with Putin's sort of traits, what would you do? What do you think would be the most effective set of choices he could make? Because I'd be really interested to see what people think. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, follow, share, and all that stuff. Take care and see you soon.